Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Black Dog Rising by Caulberg, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. The stranger had been following Emma since she passed the ruined priory on the edge of Nine Stone Downs. She first noticed him prowling beneath an archway of what might once have been the nave, wearing crisp black slacks and a pea coat too heavy for the midsummer heat. Pausing to admire the morning's glories climbing the old stones, he'd cocked his head and turned to peer at her over his shoulder as though he'd somehow heard her round the corner by the town gate behind him. The inexplicable look of recognition flitting across his pale-bearded face sent ice trickling into her veins. She'd hurried on, pulling her wheeled suitcase behind her, and took the nearest side street, hoping to blunder into the center of town. Something had rewired her internal compass from the moment she stepped off the bus from London earlier in the morning, just as it had a few months ago when she'd briefly passed through the bustling little English village en route to Cambridge. Lying 13 miles from the coast, sandwiched squarely between the priory and a family of 9 Neolithic standing stones, it seemed neither thought nor foresight had gone into planning its tangle of streets and back alleys. Its shops and cottages were a charming mix of old and new, medieval and modern, half-timbered and stone, and it took Emmeline Aubrey a total of 6 minutes to get completely, utterly lost. Her stalker had no such difficulties, materializing at the top of the high street beside the visitor center, where she planned to ask for directions. He'd tied his hair into a loose ebony bun at the nape of his neck by the time she glimpsed him across the road from the first B&B where she attempted to find lodging. Slipping through the throngs of tourists flocking to Nine Stone for the midsummer celebrations, he made little effort to disguise the fact he was following her. A second and third try for a vacant room in both the Red Lion Inn and its sister pub, the Wandering Goose, proved as unsuccessful, and each time she'd emerged from them defeated. He'd been waiting, watching, patient. Now, perched on a bench 2 doors up from an intersection the local cartographer failed to include in his free map of the village, she pretended not to notice the stranger. He was skulking behind a statue of a local 18th century highwayman some joker had seen fit to adorn with a pair of pink fairy wings. Folding the map shut, Emma cursed herself for assuming she'd find an available room in any corner of England during the tourist high season. Had she planned any better, since fleeing Shane's flat in the East End, she'd already be tucked away in some cozy B&B, phoning her mother and arranging for a return to the States, safe from her unsmiling admirer. But there had been no time to plan last night. No time at all. The stranger moved closer. Emma wheeled her new suitcase down the street, overturning it in her rush. She dragged it along and righted it as she went, hoping she didn't look as frightened as she felt. He followed, casting an occasional glance over his shoulder. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She scuttled down a dog-legged avenue, her boot heels thudding the cobblestones in a quick-time beat, and past 2 shop exits and a garbage bin before she realized she'd chosen a dead end. The whitewashed exterior of a 2-story Tudor-style building overhung the rear of the alley, the potted petunias bursting from its window boxes much too cheery for the sight of her soon-to-be mugging. She whirled, searching for a place to hide. Even if she dialed 999, her pursuer would reach her faster than the police could. The head of the alley was too far to sprint to before he would arrive. The nearest door sat only yards away, nestled in a deep stone jamb. She leapt for it, tried the knob, then swore. Locked. Pressing her suitcase into the niche with her, she pried a boot off and wielded it like a weapon. Its 2-inch wooden heel might not stand up to a switchblade or a gun, but she'd at least give him a good wallop before he murdered her. Footsteps drew near. Emma crammed herself as close to the door as she could, pulse loud in her ears, her mouth dry. Damp with perspiration, her tank top clung to her body, uncomfortable and sticky. She took a breath to steady herself. After what she'd faced last night in Shane's flat, how could she possibly be afraid of a living man? "What do you want?" she challenged, raising her boot above her head. The sounds of the village faded into the background. The walls seemed to lean close, listening to the echoes of her next threat. "I've called the police," she lied. "They'll be here any second." His footsteps halted. 2 breaths. 4. Silence. A breeze toyed with a strand of her strawberry red hair, blinding her with it. Metal screeched, tumblers thumped, and the door gave way behind her. Emma plummeted backward down a pair of short stone steps still clinging to her boot. She bounced off something warm and solid that moved with her, twisting as she went. Her head hit a surface only slightly softer than the slate floor she crashed onto, and her suitcase landed atop her. "What the hell?" a gruff male voice barked overhead. Emma cracked a brown eye open. She stared up the denim-clad legs of a man whose fists looked impossibly large from where she lay with her cheek on his size 11. She caught a glimpse of his turbulent gaze, a day's worth of stubble on his chin, and a gold stump in his ear before he slid his shoe out from under her. He took the steps in one leap and charged into the alley to bellow at her pursuer. "Oi! Don't you bloody dare!" Groaning, she rolled over, a portion of her mind noting a smear of faint char marks on the barrel-vaulted ceiling where the wall met stone. Skull throbbing, she sat up, knowing she'd soon have more bruises to add to the ones already purpling the curve of her jaw from last night. Wooden boxes were piled in neat towers to her left. Short steel barrels stood in organized rows to her right, glossy under the glare of a bare bulb. Memories clung to the floor, the paint, the arched door leading into the main building. They infiltrated her senses, screaming down the centuries, and for a split second she felt the lick of flames and heard the high keening of men in agony. No, not here, too. A shadow loomed. A terse question chopped through the unwelcome vision, demanding something she missed. She blinked, and the world righted itself. "Pardon?" "I said, are you all right, love?" Emma got to her feet before her protector could extend his hand to help. Blood dribbled down one knee, and she winced at the angry scarlet scrape running along the side of her palm. She'd stain her skirt for good if she wiped it on the floral print. "Yeah, I'm okay now." "Friend of yours?" "No," she protested, turning to face him. "I've never seen him before in—" Iridescent eyes locked on her in a liquid hue of extraordinary. Creased at their edges and wavering and unreadable, they arrested her with their depths. His close-cropped auburn hair, more chocolate than rust, was a shade darker than the stubble tending toward bronze on a strong, handsome jaw. A thread-thin scar bisected the brow he arched in answer to her silence. Far away in the recesses of Emma's brain, coherence sat down and surrendered. "Oh, hello," she whispered. The grin crimping the corner of his mouth was so subtle she might have missed it if she hadn't been staring so hard. "He was following me," she managed, pointing to the door with the hand still holding her boot. "Who was?" The memory tickled like the fuzz of a milkweed flower floating just beyond her reach. She could barely remember the color of his hair, the clothes he wore. "Well, you're safe here for now," her savior said. His voice was distinctive, as lush and toothsome as whiskey. "Why don't you come inside and we'll take care of those scrapes? Take your other boot off, though, unless you want to go stumping around like a pirate." Crimson soaked the top of her sock in a semicircle as wide as a corridor trailing from her knee. She made a face. Plopping down on a crate, she yanked the other boot off and clutched it to her chest to keep her hands from shaking. If she wasn't careful, the tremors would claim the rest of her. "Thank you," she croaked. Her adrenaline began to wane, leaving her hollow and sick. She stalled, uncertain she'd be able to stand again. The man grunted and picked her up her suitcase, wheeling it to the inner door without asking permission. Even with his back to Emma, he conveyed a casual, confident masculinity unruffled by the attack he'd thwarted on his doorstep. He couldn't have been aware of the chill in the air as she was, nor of the murmurs of whatever tragedy had once taken place here. They soaked into her consciousness, an experience becoming all too familiar as of late. Returning to the alley was almost more appealing than remaining in what appeared to be a dingy storage cellar. Fearing those murmurs might soon manifest into something more tangible, she stood and aimed a thumb over her shoulder, sidestepping toward the exit. "It's all right. I can just—" Music wafted through the inner door when he opened it. She'd never heard the song, but the homegrown gritty twang could only be Creedence Clearwater Revival. The scent of fried food and beer chased after it, soothing her jangled nerves with its normality while speaking directly to her stomach. "What?" He smirked and stepped aside, tipping his chin toward the sound of gaiety and tinkling glasses. "Were you expecting a dungeon?" "Maybe." She patted over to him. "My name's Emma. Emma Aubrey. Toby Deering, he said. That's my latest alias, at any rate. Before she could fumble her boots in one fist and offer him a hand to shake, he swung through the inner door and left her standing alone in the cellar. Nice to meet you, too, she muttered and hurried after him. Should we call the police? Emma asked. Light eased its way into the corridor linking the main building with the storage room they'd exited. Photos and paintings crowded the wall to their left. She slowed to inspect a snapshot of a building taken before the streets had been paved. Squinting at a line of ink scrawled on the photo's tattered corner, she could just make out Black Shuck, June 1903. No, he'll be long gone by now. Toby's tone, brisk and authoritative, swept her shakiness aside. Yeah, but at least the cops could be on the lookout for him? As though she could describe him if asked, she tried again to recall a snippet of the man's clothing, a hint of his hairstyle. The gap in her memory disturbed her. She put it down to fear and frowned. They wouldn't find him, Toby said. You know him, then? They paused in front of a door inset with a small window. Light from the room beyond brushed his shoulders and painted his broad chest, reflecting off the silver chain glittering around his neck. I know the coppers around here. They couldn't find their own arses if you handed them the string you'd tied them to. A woman bustled past the window, holding aloft a tray packed with empty pint glasses, her coffee-brown curls bobbing in time with her strides. Toby opened the door after she'd passed and led Emma to another door marked Office. Its interior was cool and small, every available inch of wall space teeming with pictures. They'd been hung with no chronological order in mind, some dated, most not. Many were in black and white, surrounding beer ads and entertainment notices at least 4 decades old. A miniature painting of a Georgian-era woman snuggled up to a Polaroid of the bar taken sometime in the 80s. The barman in the shot ducked from the camera, his profile a blur. The flash had set his fiery hair aglow. Toby left the door ajar and inched around a Victorian desk piled high with invoices, mail, and a stack of cocktail manuals. The scent of chips and something spicy filtering from the main room caused Emma's stomach to rumble. It felt like a lifetime since she'd eaten. Sit. He pointed to a chair jammed under a dangerously low shelf. Mind your head. She placed her boots beside her and obeyed, grimacing. She was in for a painful night ahead once she settled long enough for her muscles to lock up due to her fall. I'm glad you were there to help me out, he grunted. Does that type of thing happen a lot around here? She asked. Not really. He rifled through a cabinet and withdrew a first aid kit that looked older than both world wars. Its hinges screeched when he opened it and took out a tube of disinfectant and some bandages. Daunted by his reticence, she tried a different tack. Where are we? The Black Shuck Inn. Shuck? Like a black dog, only less irritating. Oh, she responded, though thoroughly confused. Got it. It's a phantom canine. He hauled a leather chair from behind the desk and dropped it in front of her. Protects the village. Bit of East Anglian lore and all that. You here for the feat? Something about the inn's name teased her memory. Distracted, she took a moment to answer him. No, I didn't know there was one. Well, get ready. It lasts all week. There's a bit of a to-do at the weekend. You on holiday? Something like that. He sat and peeled the backing from a bandage. Here in the artificial light, his hair forsook its chestnut hues for a subtler, earthy brown. How long are you planning on staying? I don't know. She hesitated when he wriggled his fingers in a demand for her hand. I hadn't thought that far ahead. It wasn't fair he should be this attractive. It didn't matter she and Shane had been struggling to maintain their relationship for months, nor that there was no chance in hell she ever wanted to see him again after last night. She shouldn't be considering any stranger's looks. Not this soon. She tore her eyes from Toby's mouth and trained them onto the trio of knots kinked at the chain hanging gossamer thin at his throat. I don't bite. He tucked the necklace into his t-shirt. Me neither, Emma agreed as if that were the more pleasant certainty. Then give us your hand, he ordered. She placed it in his and gasped. Electricity raced along her skin at his touch, from the tips of his fingers to the cusp of her elbow. A quicksilver surge so volatile he snatched his arm back and blinked at her. His form wavered, blurring for a moment. A fog superimposed him like a cloak. It broke apart, heat and desire swirling in its aftermath, and Emma gaped first at him, then her palm, bewildered. What was static electricity? He reached for her again, putting caution behind the movement. "And you must have bumped your head. You're looking a bit peaked." She hesitated, her stomach a muddle of misgiving. Had he not been as startled as she, Emma might have believed it was all due to her imagination, stress, and exhaustion causing her mind to play tricks on her. She steeled herself and gave him her hand once more. Nothing, just the warm, rough surface of his palm. Tension hardened the angle of his shoulders. He avoided her glances, cleaning and dressing her scrape without a word, and got to his feet to fetch a roll of paper towels from a cabinet behind his desk. Thrusting it at her, he rasped in an unsteady tone, "Your knee." She took the roll from him, determined to reset her equilibrium and bring the discomfort in the room down a few octaves. Ripping off a square, she folded it into fourths and daubed the blood from her wound. "You manage this place?" "No." He sat and crossed his arms, scrutinizing her. "I own it." Her brows climbed toward her bangs. "I've never known anyone who owned an inn before." "Glad to be your first," he said dryly. "You wouldn't happen to have an available room, would you?" Emma could no more tell how old he was than she could suss the thoughts locked behind his green eyes. The effect was disconcerting. A clock on the far wall drummed the seconds past, marking the quiet in between. She sat forward, on the verge of repeating herself when he didn't immediately answer. "Come to think of it," he interrupted her, his mouth bowed, deepening the creases beside it, "I might." She relaxed, her shoulders drooping in relief. "Thank goodness. Everywhere else is booked, and I didn't want to have to go back out and try again, not after what just happened." "Where are you from?" "Besides America, I lived in London." He tapped his fingers against his sizable bicep. "Anyone joining you here?" Swallowing, she shook her head. No, it's just me." He made a sound low in his chest. "You can have the room for a night, but after that I'd think about going back to London if I were you." "Are you booked up later?" His fingers beat in tandem with the clock's ticking. "It's the busiest week of the year. It's better for someone like you to have a friend along, a partner to make sure you're safe, at least until midsummer's past." "Why?" "A lot of people come through here for the feet. You look like a tourist. I wouldn't want you to be taken advantage of like one again, especially if our friend's still hanging around." She wanted to offer him assurances. She wanted to tell him she could take care of herself, that there was nothing to worry about, but she'd been in town for a little more than an hour, and here she sat, nearly the victim of a mugging or worse, bleeding in his office. Emma dipped her head. A night. She at least had a night to collect herself, to think, to breathe. This wasn't a defeat. Running her fingers through her hair, she used the motion to hide her crumbling composure. "One night's fine. I can hunt around for places to stay somewhere else in the meantime." "Damn it." Her voice trembled. She tried for a smile. His eyes flicked to her suitcase, then to her clothes, a hastily thrown-together ensemble one might have mistaken for poor taste in fashion had it not been for their wrinkled, slept-in condition, and then fastened on the bruises at the crook of her jaw. He stiffened. "I'll check the books. I might have an extra night available." He extended a bandage to her between his fingers. "To Lou's across the hall. Go clean your knee, put this on, and I'll tell Ruby to get the room ready. I'll meet you at the bar." Emma made her creaking way to the bathroom and paused on the threshold. She peered into the pub, able to glimpse the corner of it from where she stood. What she could see struck her as familiar. Dark-paneled wood gave the large space a cozy atmosphere. One of the biggest fireplaces she'd seen outside of a manor house arched over a hearth on one wall. Hanging over the mirror behind the bar, a portrait in oil snagged her attention. A man in a black leather doublet and a pleated lace collar smirked down at her from the frame, his moss-tinted eyes impossibly large and luminous. A pearl earring dripped from one lobe. Surrounding his lips was a shockingly red goatee groomed into a rakish point, as bright as the hair tumbling in waves over his shoulders. The artist had succeeded in capturing a charm beneath his smugness, as if he were contemplating a joke too wicked to utter, and had been waiting 4 centuries to share. He was positively bewitching, and she could have sworn she'd seen him before today. Below him, Toby stood at the end of the bar where Ruby poured a pint. He gestured upstairs as he spoke to the server. Surprise skated across her features, followed by pity. Toby nodded. Emma sighed and entered the bathroom. Better to be thought of as a battered woman in need of shelter than they learned the truth.